Science is the discipline of speaking truthfully in all disciplines, by Kurt Doolittle. Science is a moral discipline wherein we criticise our ideas so that we can speak them truthfully. We test our reasoning with logic for internal consistency. We test our observations with external correspondence. We test existence of our premises with operations. We test the scope of our theory with falsifications. Once we have tested our theories by these means, then we can say that we speak truthfully, and as such do no harm. The central argument regarding truth, that humans, in order to cooperate, humans evolved sympathy for intent, and are marginally indifferent in their judgment of intentions. This allows us to sympathetically test most human incentives if subject to the same stimuli, brackets, information, close brackets. It is also why juries can function, since its sympathetic testing of intentions is the criteria by which juries render decisions. That we cannot, however, sympathise with the equivalent of intentions, brackets, first principles, close brackets, of the physical universe. So while we intuit and we can test man's intentions, we cannot measure and test the universe's first principles. As such, the best we can do is to testify to observations and measurements of those phenomena until at some point we know those first principles, if that is ever possible. But our observations must also be reduced to stimuli that can be sympathetically tested by others, and insulated from our deception, bias and error. We call this process science, but the practice of science is little more than a set of moral rules that instruct us how to eliminate deception, bias and error. The scientific method, then, is merely a moral discipline, the means by which we struggle to speak the truth, as truthfully as we may possibly accomplish, given the frailty of our reason. That giving witness to one's observations is testable by reproduction of a set of operational definitions. That operational definitions produce the equivalent of names, just as positional numbering provides quantities with names. Such names are insulating from deception, distraction, loading, framing, and overloading. Theories are not. While we cannot demonstrate the absolute parsimony of a theory, brackets, that we know of, close brackets, we can demonstrate that we truthfully conveyed our observations. In other words, we can testify truthfully to an ordered set of facts, even if we cannot testify truthfully to parsimony of a theory. That it is possible to state instead that all outputs of scientific investigation are true, if they are truthfully represented, were, quotes, scientific investigation, close quotes, refers to the use of the scientific method, regardless of field of inquiry. But we seek the most parsimonious statement of a theory, and we can never know that we have obtained it. We can only develop consensus that we cannot cause it to fail. This is, as far as I know, the best non-Platonic description of truth available. Everything else is a linguistic contrivance for one purpose or another, possibly to obscure ignorance, and possibly to load ideas with moral motivation. Scientists load their contrivance of truth, and the mathematicians load their contrivance of numbers, limits, and a dozen other things, most of which obscure linguistic, quotes, cheats, to give authority to that which is necessary for the construction of general rules, brackets, i.e. the problem of arbitrary precision, close brackets. That Popper did not investigate into science or the history of science prior to making his argument, and that as yet we do not have a systematic account of the history of science. However, what history we do have, both distant and recent, is that science operates by criticism upon failure, where failure is demonstrated via overextension of the theory. The reason for overextension rather than criticism as the operational preference being that it is economically inefficient, brackets, expensive, close brackets, to pursue criticism rather than to extend a theory to its point of failure, then criticise it. As far as we know, this is how science functions in practice, and must work, because it is how all human endeavours must work. Because while a small number of scientists may seek the truth, or whatever a Platonist means by it, close brackets, what scientists try to do is solve problems, i.e. to manufacture recipes for useful cognition. Popper's advice was merely moral, given that the scope of inquiry in all human fields had surpassed that of human scale, where tests are subjectively verifiable. Brackets, I think this is an important insight because it occurred in all fields, close brackets. Einstein, for example, operationalised observations, brackets, simultaneity, for example, close brackets, over very great distances approaching the speed of light using the Lorentz transformations. And as Bridgham demonstrated, the reason Einstein's work was novel was because prior generations had not been operationalising statements, and as such, more than a generation, and perhaps two, were lost to failure of what should have been an obvious solution. Brackets, see the problem of length, which I tend to refer to often as the best example. Close brackets. I addressed this in a previous post, and what Popper did was give us a good advice, and while he made an argument that appears logical, like most rational arguments, unsupported by data, it is not clear he was correct, and in fact it appears that he was not. The question is not a rational, but empirical one. Popper, unlike Misesian pseudoscience or Rothbardian immoral verbalisms, engaged in a moral attempt both in politics and science, and perhaps in science as a vehicle for politics, to prevent the pseudoscientific use of science, particularly by fascists and communists, to use the findings of science as a replacement for divine authority by which to command men. What Popper did, particularly with his Platonism, was to remove the ability for the findings of science to be used as justification for the removal of human choice. Popper, Mises and Hayek were responsible for undermining pseudo-scientific authoritarianism. Of the three, Popper is perhaps less articulate, brackets, possibly to obscure his objective, close brackets, but certainly not wrong, so to speak. While Mises's appeal to authoritarianism, brackets, which is part and parcel of Jewish culture, close brackets, was entirely pseudo-scientific, by claiming that economics was deductive rather than empirical, and justifying it under a priorism, instead of, as I've stated, understanding that he was merely trying to apply operationalism to economic activity, which would merely demonstrate that Keynesian economics was immoral and deterministic, not unscientific. But Popper, Mises, Hayek, Bridgman and Brouwer did not find a solution to restoring the Western aristocratic conditions for public speech. They too were lost in Platonism a bit. Bridgman and Brouwer did understand that something was wrong, and were very close, but they could not make the moral argument. We have had a century now of attacks by verbal contrivance, and we can demonstrate the destruction of our civilization by way of it. So the moral argument is no longer one of undemonstrated results. We have the results, and we have a generation of men, myself included, trying to repair it. One must speak truthfully, because no other truth is knowable. Intellectual products that are brought to market must be warranted, just as are all other products that are brought to the market. And the warranty that you can provide is operational definitions, brackets, recipes, experience, close brackets, not theories. And if you're not willing to stay behind your product, then you should not bring it to market, because you have no right to subject others to harm. Intellectuals produce ideas, brackets, myself included, close brackets. That is our product. We are paid in measly terms most of the time for our product, but that is what we do. But it is no different from hot coffee or dangerous ladders or defective gas tanks. And given that one particularly prolific group of people has created Marxism, socialism, postmodernism, libertarianism and neoconservatism, it's about time we stopped allowing them to ship lousy products into society. and rather than regulate them by government, the common law and universal standing will allow punishment for those who bring bad products to market. The Struggle to Produce a Moral Economic Science by Kurt Doolittle. The Branches of Austrian Economics. The German branch of Austrian economics offered an alternative proposition that we can afford and should pursue inquiry into economics as a means of discovering how we may improve our institutions while preserving moral principles of cooperation. This position favours kin selection without encouraging parasitism. The mainstream (Anglo) position is instead that we should pay the cost of immoral actions via our institutions if the aggregate benefits are justifiable. This is a philosophical bias that is the result of the heavily outbred culture of the Anglos, who, for all intents and purposes, function as kin and operate under the principle of kin selection. This position encourages parasitism. By contrast, the Jewish branch of Austrian economics attempted, and failed, to cast this argument as one of science (instrumentalism and empiricism) versus logic (axiomatic deduction), while at the same time naming this axiomatic argument a science, despite not relying upon the scientific method, thus constructing a pseudo-science (meaning using the term science for credibility without relying on the scientific method to establish credibility). This position seeks to make both parasitism and contribution to the commons impossible. Just as universalism is common to the English and duty common to the German, this attempt to create a pseudo-scientific authoritarian philosophy was a result of the cultural bias of Judaism, which itself relies upon authoritative law and contractual agreement rather than the European aristocratic egalitarian cultural demand for testifiable truth regardless of circumstances. Contract is a sufficient substitute for truth in low-trust polities, but it is not a substitute for truth in high-trust polities. A tale of three cultures. Of these three positions, the German was the optimum: scientific, rational, and moral actions to achieve moral ends. The Anglo position uses science and aggregates and accepts immoral actions in order to attempt to achieve moral ends. The German position uses science, reason, and individualism in order to preserve moral conditions while achieving economic optimums. The Jewish position relies upon pseudo-science to achieve individual optimums, but ignores morality and commons altogether, because Judaic law is constructed contractually, not on principle (truth-telling), and as a diasporic culture, it does not require contribution to the commons as do land-holding social orders. Each of these cultural strategies is beneficial for island-dwelling Anglo-Universalists (truth), continent-dwelling Germans' martial culture (duty), and diasporic unlanded Jewish culture (contract). However, if we separate the pragmatism of cultural group evolutionary strategy from that which is true independent of those cultural strategies, cultural definitions of true, only the German model survives scrutiny as containing the full suite of properties: truth, duty, commons, individual and collective morality, under science and reason. The preference for the Austrian model is a preference for a moral discipline of economics. Had not the world wars disrupted the Austrian school and destroyed German civilization in a fractious civil war, this debate might have evolved and been completed earlier, instead of devolving into mainstream half-moral Anglo-aggregate morality and a discredited heterodox school. But at present, the Austrian vision of a moral economics constructed for nations, preserving kin selection, preventing parasitism, preserving both individual and aggregate morality, preserving the commons, requiring truth-telling, and operating under ratio scientific methods is displaced for two reasons. 1. The post-war dominance of (dysgenic suicidal) Anglo-universalism, justified under Keynesian socialism and Rawlsian ethics. A suicidal strategy only possible under the unique conditions of Western altruistic punishment. Westerners are the only people to develop high trust and to break the familial cycle of corruption. However, this appears to have created a weakness in that we extend this trust suicidally and ignore the reproductive and evolutionary importance of the family, tribe and nation, and in creating that high trust society in the first place. 2. The marginalisation of Austrian ambition for a moral economics because of the adoption of Marxist ideological and propaganda techniques in advocating the pseudo-scientific Jewish Austrian programme, in no small part by the Mises Institute, without whom the use of the new medium of the internet, the pseudo-scientific branch, would likely have been extinguished. As such, the term Austrian is categorised under pseudo-scientific and anti-scientific, rather than as the German branch originally evolved. The institutional means of improving moral cooperation in the pursuit of prosperity. Advances in science and philosophy. Mises's Praxeology is a failed attempt at developing economic intuitionism and operationalism. Economics is of necessity, like all scientific investigation, a ratio-empirical method for the study of phenomenon beyond our direct perception. In his failure, he attempted to create a pseudo-science to justify his authoritarian preferences. Mises's Position in Intellectual History by Kurt Doolittle. Mises's Human Action as Cosmopolitan Stoicism. He was almost right. If Rothbard and the Rothbardians had not damaged his legacy so severely, he would not be ostracised by the mainstream intellectual community. At present, any mention of his name associates a public intellectual, an economist, or philosopher with the pseudo-scientific lunatic fringe. Praxeology is a failed attempt at operationalism. Sure, but no one else came close to developing economic operationalism but Mises. I only did it because I have the luxury of a century of additional development in computability, especially Turing, and because it's clear now that the analytic programme, attempt to convert philosophy into a science, has been a failure, and the success in reforming both science and psychology has almost entirely been because of operationalism. Had Mises joined with Brouwer and Bridgman, the three of them might have saved us from a century of pseudoscience. But without a philosopher of ethics to unify them, Popper in the philosophy of science, Mises in economics, Brouwer in mathematics, and Bridgman in physics, all failed to come to the correct conclusion, that they were not in fact articulating logical constraints, because there is no logical constraints to theory development. The logical constraint is only in the statement of promise, that you are telling the truth, that such a theory can be expressed existentially as a sequence of operations, actions, or operational measures of observations. And as such, one's theory, in any discipline, is free of content that was added by error, imagination, or deception. Man can testify to observation in the execution of recipes. All else is imagination. As such, the practice of the sciences, or rather the practice of, discipline testimony, which the sciences developed, but which consists of nothing unique to the physical sciences, is a moral one with ethical constraints. As such, praxeology, mathematical intuitionism, operationalism, operationism, Popper's critical preference and the scientific method, as well as the discipline of science as currently practiced, are moral constraints, not logical ones. One can intuit to theory by whatever means possible. One can believe whatever he wishes to justify. But one's promise of testimony to the actions that did or may produce consequences is a moral one, not a logical one. As far as I know, the only meaningful reason to study economics for use in ethics and politics is to justify the rule of law, brackets, normocracy, under the single rule of property rights, where property rights is as defined under proprietarianism as property en toto, brackets, demonstrated property, close brackets, and where that body of law suppresses sufficient involuntary transfer of property en toto, that the formation of a normocratic polity is possible, normocracy, under the single rule of property rights, where property rights is as defined under proprietarianism as property en toto, brackets, demonstrated property, and where that body of law suppresses sufficient involuntary transfer of property en toto, that the formation of a normocratic polity is possible, and where the formation and perpetuation of that polity is possible, because transaction costs are sufficiently suppressed that a rational choice for normocracy is possible, over rational choice for statism, and that the normative preference of normocratic rule over statist rule is maintained by the constant exercise of that body of law in daily life, rather than the philosophical, rational, religio-moral, pedagogical, instructional, normatively habituated means of persistence. If we look at his human action as an attempt to develop an economic version of Stoicism, a mental discipline, I think it is probably a better frame of reference for his work than as economics or analytical philosophy. As such, I see him as creating a cosmopolitan version of Stoicism, brackets, economic/intellectual character, close brackets, rather than Western, brackets, Aryan, if you will, close brackets, Stoicism, brackets, political/craftsmanship character, close brackets. Both forms of Stoicism are early attempts at operationalising philosophy for disciplinary action as an individual member of a complex division of labour in which we possess fragmentary information. Since I quote him endlessly for his analysis of money and fiduciary media, which again he, brackets, quotes, a sequence of human actions equals operational observations, end quote, close brackets, correctly uses operational analysis to isolate and articulate the causal rather than the normative properties. I am clearly an advocate, but I am not an advocate of the misuse of Mises's errors, his failed attempt to develop economic operationalism, to justify Rothbardian libertinism, an outright assault on the production of both high trust and the commons, both of which are primary competitive advantages constituent in the Western Indo-European, brackets, Aryan, if you will, close brackets, evolutionary strategy. I walk by Mises's childhood home every day. It has tempered my criticism. I see him making natural errors of cosmopolitanism. As Hayek said, quote, a victim of his upbringing, close quote. Just as the Germans have made endless errors in conflating religion and philosophy to preserve their hierarchy and duty as a group competitive strategy. Just as British, brackets, Anglo/Irish/ Scots, if not the Belgi, close brackets, have fought to preserve their island universalism, despite the necessary suicide that results from universalism outside of their island, brackets, or the American island, or the Australian island, close brackets. I will venture this post is one of the more important things that has been written about Mises in recent history, and my arguments, if not my criticisms, will assist us in rescuing Mises from the lunatic fringe, and rescuing his work for use in intellectual discourse, as the first attempt at saving economics through operationalism, the way that science and psychology, brackets, if not also mathematics and logic, have been saved by operationalism. Quote, I see myself as rescuing all of Misesian/Hoppian programme from the fruitcake fringe by laundering German, Jewish and British Enlightenment fallacies. The attempt to universalise local evolutionary strategy rather than simply adopt scientific epistemology, brackets, operationalism, close brackets, as the only neutral tool for the use of studying group evolutionary strategies, close quote. Although it is, I am sure, somewhat difficult for those religiously devoted to immoral, libertine Rothbardianism to either understand or accept, I am quite sure I do not err in this analysis, a statement which I am aware further taunts libertines, but which my fellow aristocrats, brackets, libertarians proper, close brackets, both understand and expect from me as a promise. Because the Anglo-empirical model of truth-telling, quite opposite from the cosmopolitan, is that truth is the name for testimony, and as such I testify that to the best of my knowledge my statement is true, and that I bear the reputational consequence of my promise that this statement is true. That is the polar opposite of the Popperian, analytic and cosmopolitan version of true, that truth is the unknowable province of God alone, and as such we can only, quote, do what we can, close quote, and as such are unaccountable for our words. This ethic, this definition of truth, as performative, as operational, is what Kant was searching for, but could not find, and it is why both Jewish and German philosophy are dead ends, and it is why the English philosophy became lost through its influence by Germans and cosmopolitans. We lost a century of philosophy to cosmopolitan pseudoscience in economics, politics, ethics and logic. Germans lost century to pseudo-philosophical religio-moralism. Mises can be seen in context as the more successful, if still failed, attempt to rescue German and cosmopolitan thought from its religious constraints.